Hi there, everyone, and welcome back to episode 9 of the Real Film Chronicles. As always, I'm Nathan.
My name is Brian.
And today, we're going to be talking about Mank, the latest from David Fincher. So sit back, grab your popcorn and drink, and get ready.
Fantastic. I got a refreshing beverage here ready to go. I hope you do too. As you said, we're going to be talking about Mank. Came out in 2020. This is David Fincher's latest film about the film industry. I always like these movies. It's kind of a curiosity. This particular movie stars Gary Oldman, Amanda Seyfried, Lily Collins, among a whole host of other familiar faces you would recognize as soon as you get into the film. And just to give you an idea, here's the quick overview provided by the Movie DB and Letterboxd, just to give you an idea what movie you're kind of looking at as you get into this. Here it is. 1930s Hollywood is reevaluated through the eyes of scathing social critic and alcoholic screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz as he races to finish the screenplay of Citizen Kane. 100% of that I didn't know before going into Mank, to be completely honest with you. I knew it was a movie about the movies. I didn't realize it had such ties to Citizen Kane, but here we are.
Yeah, and I had a general idea. Like, I knew it was specifically about the screenwriter for Citizen Kane, but I didn't know anything about the history per se.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, Citizen Kane is Citizen Kane. It's, it's well known and well loved for a reason. It was hugely influential in the filmmaking industry, not just in terms of storytelling, kind of non-linear storytelling, which wasn't really in vogue at the time as it is now. But also just in terms of filmmaking techniques, which so much of it we take for granted now, both as filmmakers and as audience members. But a lot of the techniques in terms of camera movement, camera angles, and camera lenses, and just how they constructed sets and visual effects was pretty groundbreaking at the time. So Citizen Kane, despite it not being one of my favorite go-to movies, I mean, even if it's not one of your favorite movies, you have to recognize the influence that this picture had in culture and in motion picture history specifically.
And I might lose some credibility here, but I didn't see Citizen Kane for the first time until, I think, 2 years ago. I found a special edition of it on Blu-ray. I decided, well, I should pick this up because it's in a packaging series that I really enjoyed collecting, but also I need to see Citizen Kane, and I quite frankly was blown away with it when I did finally get around to watching it. Leading up to Mank, I knew the movie was coming out. I didn't know really what it was about, but I knew it was directed by David Fincher, and that was basically enough to get me excited for it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say we're both huge Fincher fans. I don't know if I'd call myself a fanboy, but yeah, I mean, if I could go out to theaters to see this movie when it came out, I would. This did see a very limited theatrical release in November of 2020, and then it hit Netflix just a month later. I don't know if Netflix does that just to try and get itself into the Oscar contention, but that's where we're at right now. And it did receive a whole host of nominations for acting, cinematography, obviously Best Picture, and it only won, I think, a couple of them, which I don't remember because I'm not that big into the Oscars. But that being said, David Fincher films, we're both big fans, and I thought before we jump into this Mank review, we talk about our ranking of Fincher's films. He's only done 11 feature films so far, so I think this is a pretty appropriate top 10 list. And afterwards, after we give our list, and then we'll talk about Mank.
Absolutely, 100%. It was kind of crazy. I thought I was like going crazy or something because I went to look up on IMDb and David Fincher's got 94, I think, directing credits to his name. And did I just miss a bunch of movies? But it's mostly he's done a ton of music videos. I didn't realize.
Lots of music videos. I think that's kind of how he got his start in the industry. His music videos, just like a lot of young directors, I think in the 90s when music videos were the thing to be doing, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I didn't realize it was like that many. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah. So, do you have your top 10 list ready?
Oh, I'm ready. I'm locked and loaded this time. I've got my my notebook and everything here.
So, yeah, the top 11. Let's start at the bottom. What is your number 11 Fincher film? And I gotta just, before we get into this, again, we're Fincher fanboys.
Yes.
And even the very bottom of the list are probably 3.5 or 4-star films for me. I really do love all of his movies. I love his directing style.
Yeah.
It pains me to have to put these movies into a ranking and have a bottom of the list. And conversely, it is almost impossible to make a top 3. Some of these movies, their rankings are completely interchangeable. That being said, that disclaimer out of the way, let's hear your number 11.
Yeah, like Brian said, a huge fan of all his movies, so even at number 11 is still a really good film, but my number 11 is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. For me, it's a great story. It's well directed. The special effects are amazing in terms of the aging/de-aging on the two main characters played by obviously Brad Pitt as Benjamin Button, aging in reverse, and Kate Blanchett aging in regular time. But something about the film just didn't have that maybe that's something special that some of his other films had. It's an incredibly well directed film, but just didn't have the same maybe magic as some of the other ones. But that being said, it's still a really great film, well directed story. You should go out and see it, definitely.
Without a doubt, that's a solid entry in the Criterion Collection right there.
One of the things was it was based on a short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, so at times it just feels maybe like it was a little bit longer than it had to be, maybe.
Fantastic. And my number 11, it almost pains me to put this movie down there, but Alien 3, which probably, I mean, for most people, this is a fairly universally disliked film. I saw it back in the 90s, probably a couple years after it released. I remember renting the VHS and watching it in a rainstorm with my dog next to me. I've seen the quote-unquote director's cut afterwards, just a few years ago, and the Alien Quadrilogy box set.
Yeah, was it the assembly cut? Is that what it's called?
Assembly cut? I think you might be right.
Because I think David Fincher kind of washed his hands of that whole movie.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my number 11. It almost seems like too easy of a target to throw out there.
No, that actually leads pretty well into my number 10, which is Alien 3. I understand kind of the hate it gets, but also on the other hand, it's not nearly as bad as people say it is, especially the assembly cut. I think part of it is the difference between doing what the story needs versus doing what the audience wants or expects. And for the story he wanted to tell, he did a really great job, and I think he took it back to the Alien franchise's kind of really dark kind of horror roots. But again, solid movie, but I wouldn't put it in his top anywhere near his top 3 or top 5, I think.
Yeah, without a doubt. My number 10 is your number 11. It's The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. I remember enjoying the film. I don't have any urge to see it again. It was good. I really do owe it to myself to watch it again, though.
Yeah, 100%. All right. So it sounds like we're pretty close here. So my number 9 is going to have to be Panic Room. Again.
Panic Room?
Yeah, again. So this is one out of all of David Fincher's movies, the one I remember the least was Panic Room. And so I just watched this again the other night just to refresh my memory, because I don't know if it was back in university and maybe we were drinking at the time, or maybe it was just on TV and I didn't see it all, but for some reason it didn't stick with me. But I watched it again, and honestly, there were some really, really tense moments where I was getting physically nervous, and I felt myself like tensing up and my heart racing faster. Like he's got like, just like you can see like the master David Fincher in terms of like when he constructs a thriller narrative, right? When he gets the audience involved and he's able to build that tension to such an amazing degree. Again, it's like it's my number 9 pick out of his movies, but it's still a really good, really engaging movie.
Like, out of curiosity, what star rating, out of 5 stars, did you give Panic Room?
Panic Room? Oh my goodness. I think it was like a 3.5 or a 4. So it's
I mean, that's kind of the quality that we're dealing with here, even at the bottom of the list.
This is the thing. Again, it's like it's lower on the list, but it's still a great movie. I found myself I was yelling at the characters, like, no, do this. I was like, and all the characters, even the criminals breaking into the house, spoilers for those of you who haven't seen it, but they were all felt like 3-dimensional people, right? They were given their little character beats, and it was really, really great how you don't have to go into tons of exposition and backstory. This is like really, really economic storytelling.
That's fantastic.
Number 9, Brian?
My number 9 is the title film here of this podcast, is Mank.
Ooh.
Yeah. And again, this could be 3.5 or 4 stars for me. But this is just where it sort of ended up lying, and we'll probably be talking more about the film later on. So I'll kind of leave it at that, just having Mank at number 9 for me. And I believe that brings us to your number 8.
Number 8. So this is kind of so I was going kind of by tier. So it was like a kind of a top tier, mid tier, kind of lower tier. And so like some of these might be interchangeable, but for number 8, I had Gone Girl. Again, really great atmospheric film. Really great performances, really great direction. Exactly the kind of like tension building you expect to see from David Fincher. The kind of very gritty, very moody, very darkly lit, not poorly lit, but darkly lit scenes, and like his filmmaking technique and his camera angles and all that kind of good stuff. But for me, something about the narrative maybe just didn't click. And this is one of the ones where one of the rare occasions where I actually read the book before seeing the movie.
Oh, really?
And so
Nice.
I'm wondering to what degree that knowing the twist ending had going it. Would I have liked it more at my first viewing if I hadn't known that twist? I don't know. But it's a solid movie, but for me, it's kind of middle of the pack Fincher, which is better than most other directors. But for Fincher, middle of the pack for me. Number 8, Gone Girl.
Yeah. No, I really like the idea of putting them into 3 different tiers, because even the low tier here can be really fantastic. All right, so I think that brings me to my number 7. Is that right?
I think you're on number 8.
Oh, that's right. My number 8. I just wanted to talk about the number 7 because I enjoyed it that much more.
What's your number 8?
Number 8 for me is The Social Network. This one probably would have ranked a bit higher, but yeah, I honestly don't know. It's like there's something strange about doing a biopic on such a prominent public figure as Mark Zuckerberg so early in his career. It's just that Zuckerberg's career just skyrocketed when he launched Facebook, and it just propelled him into the stratosphere. There's a lot of intrigue around it, and it felt like it was going to be an incomplete story, like an incomplete biopic when it was coming out. It's like we needed a second Social Network because so much has happened since then, and I believe that film was 2010, right? I mean, that's only a few years after the Facebook launches for the public, and here we are 11 years later, and there's a whole host of movies that deserve their own content from this thing. Social Network is number 8. Where's your number 7?
Okay, so number 7 is where I have Mank.
Oh, that's pretty fair.
Yeah, so it's tough because it's the freshest in my mind, having seen it most recently, aside from Panic Room, and because it is so it's so different from so many of his other films in terms of subject matter, in terms of filming, like it was done in black and white, specifically to evoke that kind of old-timey feel that I think works really well in the context of that film. There's just some really beautiful shots that you can get in black and white that it doesn't translate to color, and vice versa, right? Just the contrast between the blacks and the whites is like there's a real beauty in black and white when you do it properly, and there's really some great shots in Mank where just like, yeah, it took me back to like watching like Casablanca and Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane when I was a kid, and you know, like that feeling of watching some of these older movies. But again, we'll leave the full discussion for later on, but I thought Mank was a really solid entry.
My number 7 is a classic favorite, The Game. starring Michael Douglas.
Wow, that's number 7 for you? It's that low, huh?
I know.
I'm surprised.
And it almost shames me that it is that low, but I mean, this is honestly one of my first Fincher films that I think discovered back in 97 or 98. Really amazing. It's just a really fun film. I don't think it has quite all the refinements that he would become known for later on, but it's still an early film for Fincher, but it's still amazing. I love it.
Hard disagree on that assessment, but I respect it.
All right. What's your number 6?
Number 6, I'm going to have to go with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Nice.
It's not my favorite Fincher flick, partially because, and it gets more complicated here, because the original Swedish versions of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy, I love that trilogy. It's kind of one of my kind of go to when somebody asks me about favorite trilogies. I want to pull up something like lesser known besides Indiana Jones or Back to the Future. I'll recommend Girl with Dragon Tattoo. It's a really unique take on some unique work, and this one it was definitely a Fincher film, the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo American version, but it just felt like it was following too many beats of the first of the Swedish trilogy of Girl with Dragon Tattoo films. It didn't, like, I'd read the books as well, and I'd seen those original movies, and it felt like Fincher's American remake was remaking the movies as opposed to adapting the source material, even in some of the looks and feels of the character, and that for me kind of dulled the edge a little bit.
Did you read the books before?
Yes, actually, there was I don't know why. Well, I do know why, because they were a huge global phenomenon, and my wife started reading them, and then I started reading them because it was just something we could talk about and share together. Aw. But yeah, there was very interesting things, and I think some of the stuff may have some of the content, some of the themes, and some of the ideas, I think may have gotten lost in the translation to an American perspective, or a North American perspective, or a Hollywood perspective, I should say. And it just kind of blunted the edge a little bit for me. But I mean, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo still has that great, like, moody, dark, kind of oppressive atmosphere. It's got that tension, these characters with hidden motivations. Still a great film, a great soundtrack too. You got to check out The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo soundtrack. It's pretty amazing. I think it was Trent Reznor, right? I think he works with Fincher quite a bit, and it's a solid film for me. More than a solid film. I really enjoyed Fincher's version, but just not quite to the heights as the original. And again, it's a comparison between other movies as well. It's a weird way to judge it, but I can't help but be the way I am.
Don't never apologize for that.
Tell it to my wife. All right, number 6 for you.
Yeah, my number 6 is really, I mean, a lot of these items are a toss-up. Number 6 and 5 are definitely a toss-up for me. Zodiac is at my number 6. This is a brilliant film. I love the way this film looks, and I think this is where Fincher really got into using a lot of CGI and digital effects to make period films. Like, this is a film that takes place in the 70s and 80s, I believe, or maybe it's just the 70s, and it looks amazing. He would use these techniques later on in a lot of his other movies, but especially in his Netflix television series Mindhunters. I think the only reason maybe Zodiac doesn't go as high is just it's a really long film, and I'm not fully invested in it the entire time. But I'm just not being fair. I see the grin on your face, and I know. I'm trying to think of a criticism or something interesting to say. I got nothing, man.
It's funny.
Zodiac is a 4.5-star film.
Yeah, it's funny. All the things you're talking about as negatives, like I'm just like, I want more. I love the director's cut. It's like it adds more content.
Is there a longer cut of Zodiac?
Have you seen the director's cut?
I don't think I have, honestly.
Oh yeah, you need to check it
out.
out.
All right, I'll have to go check that out. All right, what's your number 5?
Number 5. Okay, these are getting to like my top like favoritist movies here. Number 5 is just on the cusp of that, and that is The Social Network. For me, it was just that perfect combination. I think Aaron Sorkin wrote the script for this, which is like, I know Aaron Sorkin is contentious among different people. He's one of those writers / directors that that people seem to either really love or really hate. And I just love Aaron Sorkin's like stylized dialogue. I love his story structure and that kind of thing. And married with, David Fincher's ability to tell a story. Like, I had zero hopes for The Social Network. I was like, they're making a movie about Facebook. They're making a movie about Mark Zuckerberg. And I was completely not against it, but I was like, I was not interested at all. Right? I had no interest in this. Like you said, it was like early in his career, early in Facebook's inception. Like, this doesn't even make sense. And I was completely, totally wrong. I was blown away by this movie. Amazing biopic. Again, it strays just close enough to the truth to be entertaining, but like, it's not an actual factual representation of what happened. It's highly stylized. You have to take this into consideration. An amazing story. Again, Fincher takes his kind of, darker storytelling techniques, building tension, and takes that from making like thrillers about serial killers and turns it into like this tension between, building this corporate empire and then this legal struggle afterwards. And it shouldn't work. Everything about it shouldn't work, but it does. It works so well for me. But it's
really amazing.
Number 5, The Social Network, the Facebook movie I never knew that I wanted.
My number 5 is Gone Girl.
Wow.
I really enjoyed the mystery angle of this, kind of the uncertainty of what the characters have done, like what they have presumably done or may not have done. I did not go into this knowing anything about it. I hadn't read the book or been spoiled in any way for the twist at the end, and I thought it was brilliant, which is maybe more of a testament to the story itself, right? I should probably go read this book. But again, he got some really good performances out here, especially Ben Affleck showing up in a Fincher film is good. And this film introduced Rosamund Pike to me as well. And everything she does has been fantastic since. It's just a really solid film. Love it.
Oh, 100%. Like, Ben Affleck blew it away. And Rosamund Pike, like, this put her on the map for me as well. Like, I'd seen her in other things, but really, like, this showed what she was capable of and as an actor. And it was some really challenging material, and she nailed it. Yes, Rosamund Pike, that was a movie that sold me. It's like, she needs to be in everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect. What is your number 4?
So number 4. So this is getting up into, like, these top 4 are essentially, like, not just some of my favorite Fincher movies, but some of my favorite films of all time. This is like peak Fincher for me, peak filmmaking, like peak filmmaking and peak film going experience. Number 4 is The Game. The Game. Yes. I remember seeing this when I was a teenager, and I remember it just like, it blew me away. Like, I don't have to rewatch this movie again. I do rewatch this movie quite a bit. I don't have to, because it was ingrained on my brain. Just every scene, every story beat, and the twist at the end, it literally, as a kid, it blew my mind.
Yeah.
If I'd encountered it later in life, would it have done the same? I don't know, but it's ingrained on me. And just like, the themes at the time weren't as relevant to me as, as a teenager, but now as, a grown man approaching 40 years old, a lot of the themes in The Game, as opposed, in terms of, getting older and your legacy and connections between friends and family, all those themes are becoming more and more relevant to me as I'm getting older. And just like, like the tension that's being built and the use of camera angles and shots and the performances and the editing, all of it together is just amazing. Number 4 for me was The Game.
Fantastic. Love that film. Number 4 for me is going to be The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Oh, wow.
And everything about this movie, I just love this movie, like how it oozes, like this atmosphere and like you said, the sound with Trent Reznor and everything. Like, it's just, this movie worked on so many different levels. And I'll be completely honest, I was completely unaware of the original novels, the original movies, nothing. I was going into this, again, just like Gone Girl, quite fresh. And I loved every second of it. It's a film that I definitely come back to every few years. It's just really great, and it's just criminal that we never got a Fincher trilogy out of this. I'm not sure if he would have come back to do another one, because he doesn't typically do sequels to his films, but this one, I find it hard to believe he wouldn't come back to this knowing that there was a set trilogy in place already. Just really
as much as I do love that original Swedish trilogy, is like, I would, of course, as a Fincher fan, I wanted to see what he was going to do with that trilogy, and it just seemed like the material and the subject matter was kind of right up his alley. In terms of he loves to tell, I think his best stories are the ones that are fall into that category of thriller or maybe horror, but also like he's really concerned, I think, also with kind of exploring political ideas, and that was kind of rife in the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy as well. But yeah, again, it's lower on my list, but yeah, it was so atmospheric. Like, there was so much tension. A great narrative with he does love his twists, so it fit him really well. Yeah, it was a good movie. Solid pick.
Yeah. And we're entering the top 3. This is a very difficult top 3. Let's hear what your number 3
this was so tough. I'm going to have to go with Zodiac for number 3. Zodiac is one of those movies that just, every time I watch it, it just keeps getting better and better and better. I have to admit, when I first watched Zodiac, it was not one of my top Fincher films, but I kept coming back to it. There was something itching away in my brain, and I come back to it again and again, and every time it just pulled me in a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. I'm a sucker for stories about the press and investigative journalism. I'm a sucker for the thrillers and the murder mysteries, but just even though it's not like a straight up maybe thriller or a straight up horror movie, there are moments in this movie that are so tense and so intense. Like, there's that one scene where Jake Gyllenhaal's character is going to this individual's house investigating the murderer, and it was specifically about the posters and to get the signature to see if it matches another signature, but the guy asked him to go down to his basement, and he's going down into this deep, dark, dank basement and he hears floorboards above him creaking, and is like, and one of the things was like, oh, the murderer might have had a basement, and it was rare. Having basements is rare in California, and it's like the guy was acting all creepy, and is like, you think like nothing could possibly happen. This can't be it. But you also think is like, oh my goodness, like this guy's in serious trouble. Like this, the tension in that scene every time, and I've seen it so many times, and I still, like, my heart's racing and like my body's tense. Like everything about that. Yeah, Zodiac is just a phenomenal film, phenomenal piece of filmmaking, from David Fincher specifically, and then like the knockout cast. You got Robert Downey Jr. and Jake Gyllenhaal, and the rest of that cast is just great. The music, like one of those scenes that you said, like I still have it imprinted in my brain. That building that skyscraper getting built in kind of like fast forward motion to kind of show the passage of time. Such a neat way to show passage of time. Really interesting. But yeah, everything about Zodiac just gets better and better for me over time.
Really, really amazing film. I gotta go check out that director's cut. Like,
yeah, pronto. You do.
My number 3 was probably my number 1 film of all time for quite a few years, and this is Fight Club.
Oh, I'm like,
1999.
What is happening? Everything I thought I knew is wrong, Brian.
I know, and it's honestly like especially the top 3. Like, these are the upper top tier of the films. It's really hard to place
100%.
these. The reason I put this one down a couple points on the rankings is probably just because I haven't had an urge to check it out in a little while. This was 1999. I remember so clearly. I missed this in theaters. I bought it on DVD. Fell in love with it from day one, and we watched it. I mean, we watched it dozens of times. It was every moment of this film is great. I love what it's doing. And really, we were kind of at this age where it seemed like very relevant to us. Like, as we were hitting our 20s, And I know this is more of a commentary for Gen X, I think, but we could definitely relate as being close to that generation. I don't know. I've ranked it a bit lower because I'm scared to go back to it. I'm scared that's going to have lost some of its magic and hold on me. So it's honestly probably been 7 or 8 years, if not 10 years, since I've seen this movie. I kind of want it to live on in my head as the best Fincher film, if not the best film I'd seen for a long time. It's really difficult to put at number 3, but man, Fight Club is entirely something else. Really, really good.
No, and I think our top 3 are. I know there's a couple overlapping here. So my top 2. So this is the thing. Like top 1 and 2 is so tough to pick, but number 2, I'm gonna have to go with Seven. Seven is just hands down just one of the best films of all time, let alone David Fincher films. One of the best thrillers of all time. One of the best. I mean, I think you could classify this as a horror film. I mean, especially when you get into some of the later elements.
Oh yeah.
Just a great horror film and just a perfect example of. I still like ingrained in my head some of these shots and some of these scenes and some of the camera work, which normally, as a layman watching film, I'm not really always tuned in to all the kind of what I'll call the cinematic grammar of like camera shots and lenses and angles and stuff. But with David Fincher, it stands out to me, not in a bad way, but in a way that it's married with the scene. It's married with the themes so well. And some of those shots are so ingrained in my head. And just like, this is peak Fincher atmosphere. Everything's dark. I think it's raining for the full, like, for the entire length of the movie. It's either raining or clouded over. Just like the darkness of the themes, the darkness of the subject matter. They got Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt in really career-defining roles. I mean, Kevin Spacey, despite his personal life, he put on an amazing performance in that movie, amazingly creepy performance. Gwyneth Paltrow was in there as well. She did a great job. You wouldn't normally associate her with David Fincher and the kind of maybe this dark material. But yeah, just the writing was on point, the directing was on point, the acting was on point, and just like every time I watch that, I have a sense of dread come over me. So yes, Seven has to be my number 2.
What a wild ride that
7
movie
of
is.
2.
My number 2 is Panic Room.
Wow.
And I absolutely adore this movie. This one seems to be a big difference between you and I. I can't remember where you had it ranked, but it was quite a bit lower.
Number 9.
Panic Room, I was amped for this film up to its release point. Jodie Foster knocking it out of the park. Oh, yeah. And there's a lot of other faces here. Forrest Whitaker, Jared Leto, and an early, like a young Kristen Stewart
also,
as
you
well.
have to bring up Dwight Yoakam as Raoul.
Dwight Yoakam, yeah. Really just this killer cast. And I think it speaks to maybe my love for more of the horror suspense films. That Panic Room and, spoiler alert, 7 is the last one, is my number 1. But Panic Room specifically is this home invasion. It's scary as hell. It's really terrifying. Yeah. It's really tense. I love the way it's shot. He really fooled around with a lot of interesting camera things where there's CGI coffee mugs and whatnot that the camera's flying through. I just loved it. I just love the atmosphere of it. I love that it was set in one location throughout the entire film. Wow.
It is pretty amazing. One of the things that stood out to me about Panic Room was like how David Fincher is able to raise the stakes in a seemingly low stakes scenario of a simple home invasion, right? This is not world changing, nobody's saving the world. It's just like a bunch of people in this really small enclosed claustrophobic setting about like some people home alone and some people breaking in to steal some stuff, but all of a sudden it's like it feels like for them, those characters, their world, it's their world that's at risk. And it's amazing how he can ratchet up such a simple premise to have that level of tension and storytelling. It's amazing.
Brilliant. If that leaves one movie left, we know what it is.
It's pretty obvious for both of us now. Number 1 for me has still got to be Fight Club. Still, one of my favorite movies of all time. The marriage of Chuck Palahniuk's dark, twisted mind and David Fincher's dark, twisted mind is just kind of perfect in terms of thematically, what it had to say. It was obviously it was a satire, maybe not obviously, looking at some of the interpretations nowadays, but it was a incredibly important satire on consumerism, critiquing, gender roles, specifically certain types of masculinity. It was, critiquing materialism, but it was doing it in a really perverse and profane way that I don't know if you could really capture. It was such a movie of its time. There's so many timeless themes in it, but it's also such a movie of its time, of the 90s and the late 90s specifically. But yeah, so much of it still holds true today, and it's like, I love how both Chuck Palahniuk and David Fincher, they love posing these big, important philosophical and social and existential questions, but they never ever give easy answers. They always leave space for the audience to answer things themselves, to the film's detriment and to its benefit, right? Because it's Fight Club is problematic because it's so often misinterpreted, and it's become like almost a Bible of sorts for like movements like the incel movement, who completely misread and misinterpret the themes.
Yes.
But I mean, for those of us, looking with critical eyes, I mean, this is just an amazing movie. And specifically, yes, I think it speaks more to male audiences than female audiences. It was dealing specifically more with kind of male themes, and how I think Chuck Palahniuk himself said that he was specifically trying to create a narrative exploring ways in which men maybe lack the sufficient means to engage with each other emotionally in a positive way, and to form, have those social scripts to form positive narratives about their lives in the same way that women did. Whether you agree with him or not, I think as a man, this still hits home for me as well in terms of some of the themes of what we now call toxic masculinity. But I think David Fincher and Chuck Palahniuk were exploring these themes before we even had that kind of term for it, right? They were in some ways they were really ahead of their time. And I could go on with like this forever about Fight Club, but yeah, number one for me, still one of my favorite David Fincher movies, and one of my favorite movies of all time, Fight Club.
Well, Fight Club sounds like a real focused episode for you that's coming up in a couple of
months.
I
think
right?
I'm going to have to do some, I'm going to have to rewatch this. As I said, like you said, we watch this constantly to the point where it's burned in my brain, where I can replay the entire movie. So I haven't seen it in a couple of years now. But I think I'm going to have to revisit it and maybe record a solo episode or do some writing here for sure.
It's going to be great. And that leaves number one for me is Seven.
Nice.
I mean, you said a lot of great things about it before. I don't know if I could add that much more to this. I love that it seems like it's kind of an easy trope to utilize in a police detective film, where you have an older cop who is literally weeks away from retirement and a young rookie just transferring into the department. In this case, like Brad Pitt's character's transferred into the city so he can tackle some real, quote unquote, real crimes. And they're both handed maybe the biggest case that they could possibly take on, and they approach it from different angles. I love seeing their detective work. I love seeing them play off of each other. It's absolutely fantastic. Like you said, it's raining all the time, but the atmosphere is dripping with greatness. I love every second of this. This film coming out in 1995, I believe. I probably saw it more in 98 or 99, and it really kind of introduced that really like gritty, like this is a dark film. There's a lot of disturbing things going on in here. So for me, it was seeing some of these disturbing things depicted on screen, seeing those for the first time, and just saying, wow, cinema can start pushing the limits of what I'm accustomed to seeing in movies. Just wow. And then, of course, that killer ending. What's in the box?
Like it's become a meme now, but you look at it back in the day, and even in the context of the film when you're watching it, and yeah, it's funny now out of context, but in the context of the film, it's like it's still so intense. It's just and this is one of those few films that, like Fight Club, I would never want to spoil for an audience just coming into this. Like there's, a next generation by this point where it's just kind of depressing to say, but there's a generation now of audience members who might not have even seen these films and going into it for the first time. And Seven is just like, yeah, it's tough for me to pick between Fight Club and Seven as my number one and two. Like it just, they're both like, to me, quote unquote, perfect films. Like they are just like, this is Fincher at the top of his game, master of his craft. This is showing why he is like, he's one of our favorite filmmakers, and he deserves to be, I think.
With those two films, every subsequent film I've expected that level of greatness. So it's kind of difficult when you go into a new Fincher film and you're wanting to recreate that height, that cinema, and it just doesn't quite achieve that. And you're thinking, oh man, what a disappointment. But then, I mean, you look at these movies, these movies are all hits. Like these are all fantastic. And putting together this list was grueling. I only spent maybe 10 minutes on this. I didn't want to spend too much time on it. I didn't want to put my mind through the stress of trying to have to determine which is better, Gone Girl or Zodiac. Where should the game go? Honestly, these are all like top
I
kind of
did it like you. I was like Band-Aid, quick, like one rip, clean off. Because I was just like, I had my like top like 4 or 5, and then after that I was just like, like you said, is like Fight Club and Seven are like, they're genre defining, cult films, and like his other films are just amazing, like it's like that. So it's like, David Fincher just came out with another masterpiece, but it's not like a genre defining cult classic masterpiece. It's like
right. It's also something to be said. I think you mentioned it a couple times. A lot of these films really are very rewarding on rewatch. Like watching Zodiac again and again, you're constantly discovering new things. I think that could be said for a lot of his films. The Social Network, you mentioned Aaron Sorkin's screenplay there, the dialogue. If you just watch the movie going in, just expecting this biopic, you're going to get something out of it. And then you rewatch it, really pick up on the dialogue and just how snappy everything is, and how Fincher is able to create a Fincher-esque film around that.
Yeah, and I love the way he's able to film dark scenes without them being too dark. Like he's able to film like visually dark scenes, but you never feel like you can't see what's going on. You never feel like you can't follow the actions. They're dark, but they're still well lit. I think there's an art form there that's maybe in terms of cinematography, in terms of that creating that scene and what I'm talking, composition, right? Scene composition and lighting, that I think it's such a fine edge to walk where you go either too dark or too light, but there's that sweet like knife edge balance where David Fincher's able to walk that visually, and he's able to film like really dark scenes that don't feel dark, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really wild. So Fincher, obviously this fantastic filmography, and really, I think kind of challenging himself with a very different film. Like this isn't a true crime film like he's been accustomed to. It's not a suspenseful, tense film.
Right.
He's really busting into different genres. Mank is a film about the film industry, something I was not expecting to get out of Fincher. And here we are with a story about Herman Mankiewicz, who co-wrote Citizen Kane along with Orson Welles. I think there was a bit of controversy where this story takes kind of an anti-Orson Welles stance, where, from what I'm reading, the general consensus is that Welles was the primary screenplay writer. He was primarily responsible for Citizen Kane, whereas Fincher's Mank storyline follows one where Herman Mank himself, he's the primary contributor to the Citizen Kane script. And I think I saw a soundbite where Fincher didn't really want to play into that one way or another. He's just presenting a history here that's interesting to watch here.
Right, but he obviously did kind of take that side, and whether that's probably based on research that he's done. But yeah, the story definitely makes it feel like Herman Mankiewicz basically wrote the original draft of Citizen Kane, and then it felt like it was left open for basically Orson Welles to kind of refine it and work it into the the masterpiece that we all know and love today. I'm not personally familiar enough with the history of Citizen Kane to make any kind of intelligent commentary one way or the other, but it feels like a lot in recent years that there's been kind of a demythologization of Orson Welles, which seems to be kind of, it's a common theme, I think, in the postmodern kind of critique and postmodern sensibility of kind of deconstruction, and especially deconstructing our mythology and deconstructing our heroes. And Orson Welles has long been held up in Hollywood mythology as like this, uber mensch kind of genius, auteur, visionary. And I think that there's been kind of the historical pendulum feels like it with Mank and with other works and with other writing. It feels like the pendulum's kind of swinging back the other way to look at Orson Welles from a more holistic perspective, as opposed to just like this genius wunderkind who came in and just like invented cinema, right?
And for this movie, I think it's worth noting that Mank was written by the original screenplay for Mank was written by David Fincher's father, Jack Fincher. And I believe he wrote it in the 90s, and it was kind of based on an article from the early 70s, which kind of introduced the idea that Orson Welles maybe wasn't 100% responsible for the screenplay of Citizen Kane. So there's a bit of history there, but I think back then it was just kind of critically panned as not a valid theory. It was kind of disproven.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, and like I'm only looking at about 5 or 10 minutes worth of Googling around here.
And the whole thing for me is, I know for some people have like real kind of, they have a dog in that fight, either philosophically or in terms of how they view film and how their relationship with film. But for me, even if Orson Welles didn't write Citizen Kane completely, even if somebody else wrote it, it's like, so what? It was still a great film. I don't think it detracts from Orson Welles' contributions to filmmaking or storytelling. No. It's one thing to write a great film, but it's another thing to take that script that's written and translate that onto the screen and make it great. So it's like Orson Welles is still a great filmmaker, but maybe he wasn't, this larger than life mythological person who was able to write and direct and edit everything himself, right? He wasn't this one man show. It's like, and that's just, look at David Fincher. He didn't write every single movie that he made, and they're all fantastic.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to have a bit of that context. Obviously, I don't think either of us had much of that context going into watching Mank for the first time, but it's important in the story because it does come up a few times. There is a subplot, I guess, going around that really gives commentary on what the film industry was like back in the 30s. And they talk about getting the Screenwriters Guild started up. And we have characters who are trying to get Mankiewicz to enroll and pay his dues and really like spearhead this. Mankiewicz was famous for getting a lot of films written. He's won multiple Academy Awards, including for Citizen Kane for his writing contribution there. So I think there's some validity to what Fincher is doing here in pointing out maybe he doesn't take a stance one way or another, but it's important to open up the discussion on what the film industry was like back in the 30s. And I think there's some interesting stuff there, like the actors and actresses who are kind of contracted to one studio. Like, you're a studio actor. One of the main characters is Marion, played by Amanda Seyfried. At one point in the film, she's leaving MGM to go to Warner Brothers, and it's such a foreign concept where just like the writing is, I think, commonly understood, in my mind at least, that a lot of people are writing a film. You'll see 2 or 3 people given credit for writing a film, in the opening credits, but I fully understand that maybe a dozen or more people have touched that screenplay, have made additions here and there, and all the behind the scenes stuff where we find out is the screenplay changes day to day sometimes. Like, scenes will play out differently. An actor might say things a bit differently. They might have something to contribute on that day. It gets written into the screenplay, right? I don't know. There's a lot of context there. There's a lot of interesting things going on.
One thing that's important to keep in mind, I think, when watching any kind of movie that's based on a real person or real historical events, is that Mank, just like those other movies, this is not meant to be history, right? So this is not meant to be the actual representation of what happened, even despite sometimes what filmmakers like Oliver Stone will say. This is a movie made for entertainment purposes, and it's based on actual people and actual events, but it's not meant to be an historical record, and so you can't read it as such. Just to contextualize all our discussions about, Mankiewicz versus Orson Welles and who wrote what. So I think it's important to contextualize that. But also in talking about that, I think what Mank did really well, like you were talking about, Brian, was really transporting its audience back to that other place and that time, partially through the use of filmmaking techniques. Like it was shot in black and white, so it's already evoking that era of filmmaking. I loved all the title screens where it was like the typewriter typing out. got that really kind of visceral, all those sounds and those specific sights and shapes. But yeah, like exploring the film industry, right? And exploring the film industry within the larger kind of social and political context of the time, and specifically with there was a specific election in California going on at the time. Yeah, specifically with William Randolph Hearst, who was like this kind of scandal at the time where, the titular character of Citizen Kane was a thinly veiled kind of, parody or caricature of William Randolph Hearst, and it caused this kind of big... there was, I think, behind the scenes controversy, and it was obviously some social commentary there. But all this was part of Mank's charm, where it was like taking the simple story about, these people writing a script for a Hollywood movie, but then you look at, it's in the middle of the Great Depression. It's in this era where unions are trying to fight for workers' rights. It's in this era where one man like Hearst can essentially control the media, which is like a theme that's prevalent today when you look at the partisanship in media and politics. So it's really interesting how Mank is able to take what on paper sounds like an incredibly boring premise. It's like, screenwriter writes a script. It's like, that sounds real fun. But then he's able to take that and go into Herman Mankiewicz's backstory. He's almost like a Forrest Gump-esque character where he's involved, or he's like peripheral to all these big events going on. And again, I'm not familiar with his actual history, so I'm not sure to what degree he actually knew Hearst and how much that may have influenced his writing that character as a kind of a stand-in for Hearst. But it was in terms of the movie, that made an incredibly compelling movie.
Oh yeah. So I mean, it's kind of important to note how the film was told narratively here. I think where the film picks up with Mankiewicz in about 1939, 1940, while he's writing Citizen Kane. He was just in a car accident. He's bedridden. He is dictating the screenplay to his assistant, or I can't remember, what her role is. But there's a number of flashbacks, and the story is told in these flashbacks that date throughout the 1930s. So, we get a flashback to when he's beating a specific character in a certain situation. There's a lot of that going on. I think you touched on the film being shot in black and white. I thought it looked pretty solid. The film did a couple other things as well to sort of bring you into that period, and that was the sound. The movie was shot in mono sound, meaning it had one channel. But what they did in the mixing was add an echo to it in the surrounds, and probably, if you don't have surround sound, you probably still notice this. Sorry, there's a certain theater echo going on in this film that I was instantly familiar with, because back in the early 2000s, we were both living up in North Bay, and we would go to this really old theater that was an actual theater. They would show movies, and watching Black Hawk Down and the others and a few other movies in that, you would get that same kind of echo. So I'm watching this film, and I'm hearing that same echo I heard 25 years ago in old theaters. It really helped to immerse me into that, even if I did find it a bit distracting every so often. Did you notice the sound in this movie?
I noticed I was getting a lot of vibration on the bass. So maybe that was it. I don't know. I was just so drawn in by the narrative and by the writing. I was really surprised how like witty this film was in terms of the dialogue. Yes. I was just like, I was so drawn in. I was drawn in by the visual stuff where like every once in a while you'd see like that the marker up on the top right hand corner of the screen, that little it's called, like a cigarette burn, but it's not a cigarette burn. It's called that little circle where the reels changed, right? And I was like little touches like that, where it's like it just like felt like one of those old timey movies. But yeah, just just these tiny visual cues to really transport you through time. I felt like immersed in this narrative. I felt like I was, in California in the middle of the summer. Like I could feel like the sweat beating on my own forehead in the California sun. It was just, talking about this, I'm liking this movie more and more the more I talk about this.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of interesting things. The cigarette burns. Honestly, the first time that happened, I was kind of rolling my eyes here. I was just like, I understand what's going on. I am also aware that this movie was shot on digital cameras.
Yeah, I would have actually. I found myself thinking, like, I really wish they would have almost dirtied up the film a little bit and made it like a grainier to imitate the old kind of film stock. It seemed like a little bit too clean. Did they film this on digital?
They filmed this on 8K digital, monochromatic, so it was never shot in color. There's no color version of any of the footage in here. But I was surprised that they did that, considering that they used period authentic instruments to create the soundtrack of this.
Awesome.
So why not create a period authentic film with the actual lenses and cameras and actual film stock? Let me see that film grain. That was the only thing that was really missing for me to really pull me in, because obviously the black and white, the mono sound, the old instruments, like everything was immersive except for the video quality, honestly. But I mean, it's kind of a wash. I'm still pulled in by the narrative, like you said.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we have to talk about Gary Oldman's performance here. I mean, you always have to talk about Gary Oldman's performance, whatever movie he's in. But this was just, I mean, and I know tour de force is kind of cliched at this point, but it was a pretty amazing performance. And just like with the help of that really incredible script, and just like really, I found myself laughing out loud at just some of the quips and some of the comebacks, specifically from Herman Mankiewicz. It was just, this is the kind of role that, I'm sure actors are like crawling over themselves for in Hollywood. It's just an amazingly rich character. I mean, Herman Mankiewicz, it's a movie about movie making, which Hollywood loves, obviously, with things like The Artist and Hugo, things like Barton Fink or Hail Caesar, even things like Tropic Thunder, right? Where it's not maybe critically beloved, but it's like filmmakers love to write about and direct films about making film. And so maybe that's why, screenwriters and people who are writers, who are writing characters, who are also screenwriters, make those characters so witty and so likable, even though they're alcoholics and they have these flaws, right?
Yeah, and that's worth pointing out, is that Mankiewicz is a pretty hardcore alcoholic in this film. He probably was in real life as well. You sort of get the impression a lot of people were back then. But Gary Oldman as Mankiewicz is playing an incredibly charismatic character, right? I loved watching his interactions, and just like you, I was kind of pleasantly surprised by how witty and sharp some of the dialogue and jokes were. One scene that really stood out was his walking onto the set of a film where he encounters what is his name, L.B. Mayers.
Oh yeah,
of MGM, and they have this dialogue, and he turns around, he sees Marion Davies mid scene. Basically, they sort of finish wrapping the scene for a second. He just wanders up. They're having this killer dialogue back and forth. And, man, this guy, he belongs in Hollywood. He then wanders over. So Marion Davies, I don't know if it's her husband, is
yes,
William Hurst. Yeah, so basically he directing or he's just kind of hanging out as well, but he gets his attention, he wanders over there, they have some dialogue, and it basically wraps up with Hearst sort of it is it was like this old school dolly with like 15 people on it. They end up riding off and he's just sort of turns around and is just like, I like that guy. And it's like, yeah, Mankiewicz is a difficult character not to like.
Well, I think they set him up. I think there was specifically a metaphor of having him as the fool or the court jester. And I know a lot of people talk, like for a lot of people who don't have maybe a literary background or an academic background, like it may sound like an insult, but a lot of times the fool or the jester character in stories, especially older stories, he was essentially a character who was actually the wisest of the characters, and he would speak these truths, right? He would be given license. Everyone would look at him as like, oh, he's this clown, but he was given license to speak truth, and specifically to speak truth to power. And so but it was entertaining, right? It was this very kind of complex role that's often maybe it doesn't translate to kind of modern terminology, but he was like, Mankiewicz was essentially Hearst's court jester in that sense of, he found him very entertaining because he would always speak his mind, and he would always kind of challenge other people's assumptions. And you think like, oh, like these rich, powerful people don't like that, but they actually do have that. It's interesting to have that, how they need that still. They need somebody to tell them to their face. It's like, oh yeah, you're this rich, powerful guy who's influencing politics, and to call that out, right?
And they specifically call Mankiewicz a court jester near the end of the film. I think we're beyond the point of spoiler warnings, which is fine.
Hashtag spoilers.
L.B. Mayer really does not like Mankiewicz, I think, because he is kind of outspoken in that way, right? He's going to speak those truths. And there's this really bananas scene near the end of the film where Mankiewicz kind of crashes this dinner costume party and goes on. How long is the scene? Like 10, 15 minutes long?
So to give context to this first, though, so there was, so MGM, I think that was, MGM essentially made a propaganda film to help win this California election for the Republicans. And it was a friend of Mankiewicz specifically who was kind of given his first directorial debut to direct this propaganda film. And so this guy afterwards, he started to feel guilty because he's like, oh, I swayed the election unfairly. He ends up, spoilers, committing suicide. And so Mankiewicz essentially kind of blames MGM, specifically Mayer and specifically Hearst, because Hearst is bankrolling MGM. And so he comes in to this dinner and he's drunk and he's upset because he's blaming them and he's blaming the social structure that they created for his friend's death and his friend's suicide. But yeah.
There's some really surreal scenes in here. Earlier in the film, they're having more of a generic like social gathering. And everyone is around in this giant room. There's couches and chairs. People aren't like just seated in modern day living rooms here, right? This is an entertaining room, and people are just speaking.
Well, it makes me wonder. It's like back in the day, you didn't have TV and things like that to distract you. So it's like you're just sitting in a room and you'd have like conversations. And so if you were a witty conversationalist, all of a sudden it's like your value goes up tenfold because that's entertaining. But to go back to that final dinner that you were talking about, it's that 10-minute scene where Gary Oldman's as Mankiewicz goes in there and he's creating this story, which is essentially mocking Hearst and all these other people in there. And like slowly but surely, all these other people who are all dressed up. It's a weird costume party where they're dressed up as like, the theme was like the circus. Again, I think that's some commentary maybe on Fincher's part on Hearst and his whole entourage, and the rich in general. But then like Mankiewicz is drunk and he's laying into these people, and like you can tell like Mayer he's fuming, but Hearst is just sitting there super calm. And Hearst, played by Charles Dance, by the way, you may know from Game of Thrones as the Elder Lannister. Also, you may know him from the Underworld series as that old vampire Thomas. But Charles Dance, and he's just like, he's got this presence, but he's just sitting there super calm. And like, I was waiting for him to like just explode on this guy because he's ruining his dinner party. People, eventually he's just left alone. And it's just Hearst and Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz, like, everyone's leaving, and then finally he throws up on the floor, and everybody leaves except for Hearst. And Hearst just, like, calmly goes over to him, puts his arm around him, tells him that story, the parable of the dancing monkey, obviously implying that Mankiewicz, he viewed him merely as this object for his own twisted amusements, and he has no other value as a human being or to him. And he just calmly walks him down the hall, tell him the story, and just like calmly pushes him out the door and closes the door behind him. And it's just like this, there's a menace to that conversation that wouldn't have been the same if they got into a screaming match. You know, it was so subdued, but there was just so menacing. And you just like, you feel sick afterwards, right? Because you realize like Mankiewicz thought he was actually contributing and he was actually part of that circle, but really Hearst always viewed him as just this, essentially this dancing monkey. He was of literally no value and easily replaceable to him. And it's like there was that commentary not just on their relationship, but on the relationship between kind of the upper and middle to lower classes as well.
Yeah, I really like how you describe it. The end of that scene is just the pure menace that it was. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I think you nailed it right there. That was a hell of a scene, really.
in a movie full of incredible scenes, like that was an incredible scene, and to go and have it like that long. I don't think it was one take, if I recall, but it was like that's an intense scene to keep having to get back into character for, right? Like,
well, what's interesting, you make a mention of the takes. So this one apparently was filmed over 100 times, 100 different takes to quote unquote get it right.
Yeah, one of the things about that scene too is like Gary Oldman is acting drunk the whole time. And I don't know if you've ever tried to actually act drunk when you're not drunk. It's actually really hard not to go like over the top and be like turn into a caricature. But he's like, the way he just slurs his words and the way he's like not comically off balance, but you can tell he's just having a little bit of trouble controlling himself. I don't know. I don't think Gary Oldman actually got drunk for that scene. I'm hoping he didn't, and
Probably not, because he wouldn't be able to maintain it for the length of time it took.
Yeah, and just like I don't know if people are just aware of what a razor's edge it is to play that kind of state of being drunk, and like there's a tendency to like overplay it and being over dramatic, but he just plays it so subtle, right?
Yeah. One of the earlier scenes that was pretty notable as well, enough so that you messaged me while you were watching the movie, was the film pitch earlier in the film. And I thought you might want to talk about that for a moment, because that was a really fun scene to watch, where you're seeing these characters like not only bounce off each other, but they're kind of like creating a film and selling it in one spot. It was really fascinating.
Well, I love how it's almost like pulling back the curtain and seeing like the Wizard of Oz is really just a man behind a curtain pulling the strings, and like to see that magic stripped away. Like, it just, not just in the film industry, but imagine if somebody came into your work and they saw only the final product of what happened, and it's like, oh, that's pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. Right? You do that, you create this amazing, but then they saw how it was actually done in the back end, and like, this is insane. Like, this is crazy. Like, how does anything actually get done? Just like to see how the sausage is made. But it was just really interesting. Yeah, like these, like Mankiewicz and a bunch of other writers go into this meeting with the studio execs, and they're supposed to have this film written or this film ready to pitch to them, and it's clear they have nothing, and they're just making up a movie on the spot.
Yeah. And they throw the climax onto the new guy, right? At the very end.
Yeah,
right?
It's like almost like a rite of passage, right? Or kind of this, induction into our world. And he's like, and he comes up with this ending, and it's like, this actually sounds like a pretty neat little monster movie. But it's just like,
it's really
I don't know if like it felt like the studio guys weren't in on the joke. But it felt like the writers were all just like, it was almost like they were like, you get to that place in your job where it's just like you're so cynical about that job. Maybe it's just me.
Yeah.
But I think you get to that place where just like, boss wants another movie. Okay, so we're just gonna go in and like we're gonna have a little bit of fun with this, and we're gonna be like just make it up on the spot and see if he can figure it out, right? Just like those little games you play at work to kind of amuse yourself.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I feel like back in the 30s when they're depicting these film pitches, like Mankiewicz essentially is employed by MGM at the time. Like he's a full-time employee of that company, and they would have a group of writers, and Mankiewicz is kind of the leader of those writers. So it stands to reason that they would be pitching stories, or pitching movies almost every day. Unlike today's Hollywood, and I don't try to pretend to know how Hollywood works right now, but from what I understand is that there are pitches happening all the time, and it's just like it is impossible for one person to stand out. Nobody is an employee of the major studio. They're pitching to different agents, and they're pitching to different people all over the place. What a different process it would be to get a film made.
unless it's a Netflix film, in which case you just call for customer service and you can probably pitch them a film.
Yeah, exactly.
But just seeing like the studio system back in the day, where I think you were talking about, like writers, but also actors would specifically be signed with a specific studio, and like it's bizarre when you think about today. Like they would actually have like morality clauses in their contracts where they couldn't be seen to be promiscuous or like drinking alcohol or other things in their real lives. Just like they really had control over people, specifically women, right? They were a lot more concerned with the images of women, as historically that makes sense in terms of how society has treated women. But it's just insane how much control these companies had over individual people's lives, and how people were tied as the studio is like, of course, I'm an actor and I only make movies for one studio. I'm a writer and I only write movies for one studio. Of course, back then it was like, yeah, it's a no-brainer. And now we look back at that and it's like, that's insane. Like it's the craziest thing you can think of, right?
Well, it's this beautiful scene. I love the scene where at this point in the movie, Marion Davies is leaving MGM, and she's on the studio lot, but also Mankiewicz is kind of racing to meet up with Marion to tell Hearst not to run these political ads,
propaganda films.
Exactly. They're these propaganda films. He meets up with her in the car while she's driving off the lot. And it's just like, can you tell him not to run this? And I think she sympathizes with them. She would do it for him, but she can't go back because she's done her exit already. So there's a whole party, a whole event happened. She made her exit. She never plans on stepping foot on MGM grounds again, right? She's going over to the Warner Brothers, and she just can't do this pretty important thing for Mankiewicz. I just love it because it's kind of played for comedy as well. She says, please don't laugh at this. So Mank is stone-faced through it. He just gets out of this moving car. They're not moving that fast. Walks out of this moving car and just starts breaking up, like just starts laughing in one of the alleyways of this.
Not laughing because it's funny, but laughing at the absurdity of the whole thing, where it's like thematically what's going on, right? Is he's realizing this cynicism where people are more concerned about their own image, and this woman that he had like a platonic affair with. It wasn't really clear, but this woman that he cared about, and he thought there was something deeper, and he kind of realized is like, no, like she's part of this kind of rich, kind of upper class too, that are more concerned about appearances than actual people's lives and people's well-beings, right? And so there was that kind of commentary in there. That was a key scene where he was kind of having that break with the upper classes, where it felt like Mankiewicz was kind of in between like the kind of lower and upper classes. He was almost like this go-between middleman where he was like very socially mobile, right? He was hanging out with all these different people from these different walks of life. And then that was part of the disillusionment I think he started to feel with those kind of upper classes and the rich people that he was hanging out with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like the film probably could have delved into that a little more than it was, but there was a ton of subtle nods to that, and I don't feel like he was really conflicted that much throughout the movie. Like he wasn't facing his own conflict on, which side does he want to sort of lie on. He's definitely the lone wolf out there.
Well, I think part of that scene with Marion, really, I think that was his own character growth and starting to see kind of his own selfishness as, not picking sides, but then him not picking sides and not voicing up, he would make all this commentary on things when it suited him, but as soon as like he knew about that propaganda film being made, and he went to see that studio exec that he kept butting heads with, but he didn't really take a stand, right? He's just like, oh well, I guess like they're doing this bad thing, what can I do to stop it? And then he even goes to, like, he knows that his friend who made this propaganda film is starting to feel guilty, goes to try and stop him from committing suicide. He's unsuccessful. He manages to get the bullets, but not the gun. And he goes back to to this gentleman's wife, and it's like, but he's got like a whole box full of bullets, and that whole thing. But it's like, so in that sense, you can tell when he goes to that dinner, the Republican Party, when they're on the night of the election and they're counting things up, it's still not clear whether he's against that particular candidate because of political ideals or because of his personal relationships with Meyer and Hearst. It's probably some kind of combination in there, but you can see him starting to come down on a side, as it were, in his own way. But yeah, this is what's great about this movie and about this character of Mankiewicz, Mank, is that he's not portrayed as this perfect character. He's portrayed as a deeply flawed man, despite his charm and his wit. There's obviously a darker side to this guy, and I really appreciate that they didn't try. This wasn't a movie about rehabilitating the image of this historical person. It was, using this historical setting and these historical people and these historical characters to explore these larger ideas and to give voice to, that political push and pull between, the populist fighting for workers' rights versus this, somebody a bit more detached who's being, funded by big corporate interests. And you look at like the formation of the Writers Guild, which is a union for writers, and like Mankiewicz isn't taking a side on that. Specific, and then you look at all that in the context of the Great Depression, because I think one of the reasons he's not fighting for workers, specifically for writers, to get higher wages is like, he's like, do you realize, he's talking to his brother at one point, he's like, do you realize if you told the public, it's like, yeah, you guys are making $750 a week while people are like starving out there to death, you think people are really going to support your union? And so it's like, it's obviously, like it's more complicated in the Great Depression, right, to put even more kind of historical context. And like, it was all these different layers working together, and at the heart of it, and they kind of, in David Fincher's narrative, in David Fincher's version, explaining, this onion and peeling away these layers of the onion to get at the heart of it, which was at the heart of all this, all these different strands in this web was, Mankiewicz writing this script and kind of tying all these threads together and showing, like, I think maybe the intent was to show that Citizen Kane, it was a triumph in filmmaking, not just because of, like the quality of the writing and the quality of the filmmaking, but also for ways in which it, both reflected and challenged like social conventions of the time, right? And how it fit into that, and how it fit historically into that period.
Really fantastic. I mean, the more you go on about it, the more we talk about this, I think I'm appreciating the film that much more. I wasn't sure where it landed for me initially. Like, I knew what I was watching was good, partly because I couldn't take my eyes off it throughout the entire runtime. I was pulled in. The movie is just over 2 hours long. It doesn't stay too long. It doesn't feel like it's been cut down at all. This movie just really hits properly, I think. And it's interesting to see a lot of divisive opinions on it online. Quite a few negative comments about it, but it is generally critically well received.
No, and I don't think it would be a David Fincher film if it didn't have that kind of dialogue where people seem to really love it or really hate it, which to me is a good sign. Like, to me, the worst thing you can say about a piece of art is that it was boring or it was forgettable or it's like, I didn't really care. Like, no, like if you take a piece of art and you really, really love it or you really, really hate it, I think that piece of art is doing its job and that artist is doing its job. So for Mank to be like, have the one camp to be people love it and are fawning over it, and the other camp to be like, oh, I hate this. Why is this even made? I think that's a sign of a great filmmaker, and I think that fits well into. You could probably say that was the reaction for just about every film that David Fincher's come out with.
Mm-hmm. You're not wrong, for sure. With all that being said, I don't know if you have anything more to add on it before I ask you a question of which I'm pretty sure I know the answer to.
All right, shoot.
Are you going to be buying this film on Blu-ray when it comes out?
Oh, this is kind of like a trick question, right? I mean,
yeah.
But yeah, so absolutely. I've got David Fincher is one of the directors I have carved out on my shelf of a physical media. I have a specific director section, and David Fincher is one of those directors where I have a specific section carved out for his movies. So yeah, Mank, I'm definitely going to pick up on hopefully 4K. Hopefully there's going to be a 4K release of this.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to say because this is a Netflix film. Their home releases, like their physical media releases, have been handled in different ways. And we've seen Criterion pick up some of the other films like Marriage Story and The Irishman and seen them get really nice releases. I'm the same way. I don't have a specific director section on my shelf, but I do own every Fincher film. It's one of those kind of low-hanging fruits. Obviously, the movies are good, but also there's only 10 of them. And now there's 11, so it doesn't really, it's not out of the realm of possibility to just go buy another one. Even if the film was 2 or 2.5 stars, I'm still going to go in and grab this to complete that Fincher collection. But just having talked about it right here, I kind of look forward to watching this again.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, if you're getting into film and you want to start with a filmmaker, like David Fincher is great, not just because he's a great filmmaker, but because it's easy for the completionists out there. You can easily pick up all of his films. The great thing about them is that they're easy to find too. And even Benjamin Button was released on Criterion as one of the budget releases, one of Criterion's budget releases, easy to find. I think the only other Criterion he had was The Game, I think.
Yes, which was a nice
pickup. Yeah, it's sitting on my shelf. If there were any more, I'm sure I would own them. But
that's really good.
What was your rating out of 5 for this? Out of 5 stars?
Oh man, I saw this about 2 nights ago, 3 nights ago maybe, and I wasn't sure what to rate it. I've thought about it. I was asked this the other day. I thought maybe 3.5 stars, but honestly, I mean, after today's discussion, I could see easily 4 stars. Now, 3.5 stars would be the lowest I've ever rated a Fincher film, I think, and I don't think it deserves to be that low.
Okay.
So I'm going to sit in at about 3.5 or 4 stars, but I'm going to sit on the fence on that one.
Okay, so like it's always tough to rank movies when you first see them, but it looks like I ranked Mank a 4 out of 5 stars plus the coveted heart on a Letterboxd.
You gave it the heart.
Just nice. For context, if you recall, Mank I ranked at 4 out of 5. And Mank was number 7 on my list of David Fincher films.
Yeah.
So again, if you're listening to this and wondering about my bias towards David Fincher, it's like just to put everything I've said in context, I'm a huge fan of David Fincher. So maybe take everything that I've said take everything we've said with a grain of salt. It may be good to also go and listen to somebody who really hates Fincher to balance us out, maybe. But
Like, I'm kind of tempted to go online and try and find some of these negative reviews just to see what it is, because I really can't think of anything negative to say about this film. I mean, I mentioned rolling my eyes a bit with the cigarette burn. I wish he did it on film stock rather than digital, but like, what kind of critique is that? That doesn't feel all that legitimate. I mean, they are parts of the film.
But it's also, like you're saying, I think it's kind of minor. Like, this is the thing. It's like...
Yeah.
Like David Fincher's filmmaking is just so good, is like it comes down to kind of nitpicky stuff, right?
Yeah. And I don't really want to go down that road of just picking apart little things. We could talk about the historical accuracy of items. Like I think a lot of the political subplot didn't happen with Mankiewicz involved. It was kind of added in there for the intrigue of the film.
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm not going to split hairs.
No, again, a big disclaimer: when you're watching movies that are quote unquote based on a true story or on historical personages, they're still just stories. If you want the actual historical accuracy, you have to go and do research in actual historical texts. Don't take movies as history, boys and girls.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was also interesting that David Fincher's father wrote this film, which we did mention before. I think Fincher's been trying to get this made for just over 20 years now, since the mid-90s. I'm sure, just like Mankiewicz and Wells, multiple people have had their hands on that script and have modified it, but I think this is the only film where Jack Fincher has received credit for, and it's like, man, I would have liked to see more of this stuff. He put together a solid story.
Yeah, just for context, is his father still alive? Right.
No, he's not.
So this was a kind of a neat kind of memorial to, or tribute to his father even, right? So it puts, I mean, that's another, so it feels, like this feels like it felt like a very personal film, and maybe that kind of helps explain why, right? Recommendations?
Definitely recommend watching this movie. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a Fincher film I wouldn't recommend, and this one, being so nicely available on Netflix, is an easy watch, I think. I think this is definitely worth your time. Maybe go into it with a bit of knowledge about the real life events, but stick around for the characters, the acting, the story. There are multiple layers working here. I thought it was just a really solid, intriguing film.
Yeah, this was I definitely recommend checking out Mank, whether it's on Netflix or whether hopefully we get a physical media release of this. But yeah, I was kind of turned off by the subject matter. It seems doesn't seem very engaging. But yeah, it's David Fincher, and it's an incredibly engaging narrative, incredibly witty script and screenplay, and an incredibly kind of personal narrative. It's all around. It's a really great film. Highly recommend.
Fantastic. So that kind of wraps up episode number 9. I can't believe number 10 is right around the corner, Nathan. This is wild.
Oh, we're here to stay, baby.
Right? As always, we really appreciate you listening and hanging out with us today. We look forward to the next time.
As always, keep it real.